The smell of scorched metal still hung in the air when I wheeled my suitcase out the front door and locked the gate behind me. Behind me, Linda Prescott was standing in front of my garage door, the one I had just welded completely shut, with her silver Mercedes still parked inside. She was screaming. I didn't turn around. 20 minutes later, my plane lifted off the runway. 14 days after that, I came home to a collapsed reputation, a stack of documented evidence, and a car repair bill she would never forget. But none of it would have happened if Linda Prescott hadn't decided, on a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning in June, that my private garage was her personal parking spot. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Then let me take you back to where this whole thing started. I am not a man who raises his voice. I spent 22 years working industrial welding contracts, and then another decade consulting on mechanical engineering projects. And somewhere along the way, I learned that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. My garage taught me that, not the structure itself. Though I had poured close to $40,000 into that space over the years, turning it into a fully equipped private workshop, but the discipline of the work done inside it. A MIG welder does not care about your feelings. Steel does not negotiate. You either know what you're doing, or the metal tells you that you don't. It was the first Saturday of June when Linda Prescott decided to test that lesson on my property. I had been awake since 6 in the morning, moving through the garage with the specific kind of focus that comes from knowing you're about to leave for 2 weeks. Florida, Clearwater Beach, a fishing charter I had booked in December, a scuba certification course I had been putting off for 3 years, and a bungalow rental 30 steps from the water. I had planned this trip for half a year. I was not going to rush the preparation. I moved each tool to its labeled position, the MIG welder powered down and covered, the C-clamps racked by size, the parts cabinets locked. The garage door was open to let the morning air circulate. My truck was already parked on the street. Inside, everything was exactly as I wanted it. The horn came first, 2 sharp blasts, the kind that says I am not asking a question. I stepped out of the garage and watched a silver Mercedes E-Class, 2019 model, reversing smoothly and deliberately into my workshop. Not pulling up, not pausing, reversing in, as though the decision had already been made and my presence on the driveway was merely a formality to be processed. Linda Prescott stepped out of the driver's side door in a navy blazer and expensive sunglasses, a tablet tucked under one arm. She looked to the way people look when they're performing official business rather than conducting human interaction. She gave the garage a brief, satisfied scan, the way a manager surveys a room before a meeting she called, and then she looked at me. "I need to use this space for a few hours," she said. "The midsummer block party is right across the street. We don't have enough parking. You're not going to be using this today anyway, are you?" It was not a question. I want to be clear about that. There was no rising inflection. There was no pause that suggested she expected a response. It was a declarative statement dressed in the grammatical clothing of a question. And the distinction mattered, because it told me exactly what kind of conversation I was dealing with before I said a single word. Before I could respond, she reached into the car, and I heard the soft chime of the Mercedes' infotainment system activating. "My car has a comfort cooling system," she said, not looking at me. "I'm going to leave it running. It's already warm out." The screen in the center console lit up, the 3-pointed star logo rotating slowly. She did not cut the ignition. She switched it to accessory mode, display bright keyless entry module active and humming. I told her clearly and without any particular heat that this was private property and that I did not authorize the use of my garage by anyone while I was absent. I told her she would need to find another arrangement. She pulled up the HOA's governing document on her tablet and pointed to section 4.7, a clause permitting the association to request temporary use of personal space for community-approved events. She read a line of it aloud with the practiced confidence of someone who has wielded a policy document before. I listened, and while I listened, I was already noting, quietly and without expression, that Section 4.7 was written to cover front yards and shared walkways, not enclosed structures. It did not apply to a sealed garage, not even close. But I did not say that to her. There was nothing tactically useful in correcting her in the driveway. I told her again that she did not have my permission to leave the vehicle there. She looked at me the way people look at something mildly inconvenient, a traffic cone, a misplaced sign, and said that she would be noting my non-cooperation in the HOA's official violation log. Then she turned on her heel and walked across the street toward the block party, leaving the Mercedes sitting in my workshop, the garage door still open, the infotainment display glowing softly in the morning light. I stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at the car. I could see the center screen from where I was standing, the rotating logo, the ambient lighting still cycling through its welcome sequence. The alternator was off. The system was drawing directly from the 12-volt battery, steady and uninterrupted. I looked at my watch. I looked at the truck parked on the street. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my attorney. Tom Hendricks answered on the second ring, which is one of the things I appreciate about him. He's been handling real estate law in this county for 17 years, and he does not waste time on social pleasantries when someone calls him on a Saturday morning. I described the situation in under 3 minutes. He asked 2 clarifying questions: whether Linda had a written authorization from the full HOA board, and whether the garage had a fixed enclosing structure. I answered yes and yes. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, Section 4.7 does not cover enclosed private structures. That clause was written for driveways and front lawn use during neighborhood events. Her car is an unauthorized vehicle on your private property. You are within your rights to secure that property by any legal means available to you. I thanked him, ended the call, and walked back out to the garage with my phone. I documented everything methodically: the Mercedes' position relative to the property line, the license plate, the timestamp on each photo, the angle of the garage door, the position of the infotainment display still glowing in the interior. I photographed the HOA violation notice she had mentioned, which I found tucked in my mailbox by the time I came back around. I composed an email to the HOA board's general address, not Linda's personal account, but the shared governance inbox that all 5 board members received, and I wrote it in the tone of a man filing a maintenance report, rather than a man who is angry. I described the vehicle, the date, the time, the request I had made, the refusal that followed. I noted that Section 4.7 did not apply to my garage under its plain language, cited the relevant paragraph, and stated that I was requesting immediate removal of the vehicle. I added a single closing line: if the matter was not resolved within 30 minutes, I would exercise my legal right to secure my private property. I sent the email, put the phone in my pocket, and went back into the workshop. No response came. I gave it 35 minutes. Nothing from the board, nothing from Linda, no movement near the Mercedes. I looked at the garage door, a steel roll-up, commercial grade, with a fixed steel frame bolted into the poured concrete footer on both sides. I had installed it myself 6 years ago. I knew every weld point and stress junction on that frame, the way a musician knows a piece they have played 1,000 times. What I was considering was not complicated. It was not permanent. It was not destructive. It was a temporary mechanical modification to my own property, something I could reverse with an angle grinder in under 20 minutes. It would, however, be entirely, unambiguously effective. I pulled on my welding jacket, clipped the auto-darkening helmet to the bench hook, and powered up the MIG welder. I brought the garage door down to its fully closed position and used 4 C-clamps to fix it against the frame while the metal settled. Then I ran the first bead, a 15-centimeter continuous pass along the lower left contact point between the door panel and the fixed frame. The arc crackled and spat, filling the space with the familiar sharp smell of burning steel. I moved to the lower right, then the upper corners, then 2 intermediate points on each side, 8 weld positions in total, each bead laid with the same even hand pressure I use on structural work. Not hurried, not excessive, just thorough. When I finished, I let the metal cool for 5 minutes, then gripped the door handle with both hands and pulled with my full body weight. The door did not move. It did not flex. It did not rattle. It held the way a thing holds when it has been done correctly. I mounted a wide-angle security camera to the soffit above the garage door, the kind with cloud backup and 30-day rolling storage, angled to cover the full approach from the street and both sides of the driveway. I affixed 2 notices to the property, both printed at the correct dimensions required by the state statute I had looked up while waiting for Tom to call back. Private property. Trespassing prohibited. Video surveillance in effect. 1 on the garage door, 1 on the front gate post. Then I sent a single text message to Linda Prescott's number. I told her that I had secured my garage under my rights as a property owner, that her vehicle was safe inside, and that when she was prepared to address the matter through proper legal channels, she should contact me through her attorney. I walked back inside, finished packing my bags, and loaded the truck. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the sealed garage door one last time. The welds were already cooling to that dark, clean gray that good steel takes on when it's done properly. The Mercedes would be fine in there. Climate stable, no direct sun, no physical risk. The car had everything it needed to sit safely for 2 weeks. Everything, that is, except a functioning alternator to recharge the battery that was still, at that very moment, quietly powering an infotainment system nobody was watching. Hold on. He just welded the garage shut. No shouting match, no police call, no passive-aggressive note on the windshield. He just welded it, sent 1 text, and left for the airport. That's the energy. But here's what I need you to notice, because it matters for what's coming. That Mercedes infotainment display was still on when he sealed the door. Comfort cooling active, keyless entry module running, 12-volt battery draining 1 steady amp at a time with no alternator to top it back up. Linda Prescott does not know it yet, but she started a very patient clock the moment she parked that car. Chapter 3 is John on the beach. Comment where you're watching from, and enjoy the contrast. The bungalow at Clearwater was exactly what the listing had promised. Wood-planked floors, a ceiling fan that moved the salt air in lazy circles, and a view of the Gulf that started at the back porch and ended somewhere around the horizon. I had arrived on a late Friday flight, slept 9 hours without interruption for the first time in months, and woke up to the sound of pelicans working the shallows. I made Cuban coffee with the stovetop pot I had packed specifically for this trip, stood on the back porch barefoot, and drank it watching the morning light hit the water. This was what 6 months of planning looked like. This was what the work was for. I opened my laptop once that first morning, logged into the security camera's cloud feed, and let it run for about 45 seconds. The garage door, sealed, unchanged. The Mercedes, visible through the lower camera angle, parked precisely where Linda had left it, silent and undisturbed. The infotainment screen was still on, the glow faint but detectable in the frame. I watched it for a moment, the way you watch a candle you set on a windowsill before leaving the house. Then I closed the laptop and went down to the water. The fishing charter on day 2 ran out into the Gulf at dawn. A 28-foot center console, a guide named Marco who knew every structure in the bay system, and 4 hours of working live bait along grass flats and water, so clear you could count the spots on a redfish before it took the hook. I had my phone on silent in the dry bag. That evening, before dinner, I pulled up the camera feed again for what had become a brief, almost ritual check. Day 1, 4:47 in the afternoon. Linda had appeared at the driveway, knocked on the garage door frame, which was a strange thing to do to a welded surface, looked at the biohazard orange camera indicator light for a long moment, and walked away. Day 1, 7:15 in the evening, she returned with a man I did not recognize, presumably her husband. Both of them peered into the gap between the door and the sill. Both of them left. The Mercedes center console was still faintly lit, though the intensity seemed marginally lower than the morning. I noted it the way an engineer notes a data point, without drama. The scuba certification course ran Tuesday through Thursday. The instructor was a retired Coast Guard diver who had the useful habit of explaining physics in plain language and the more useful habit of not repeating himself. I spent those afternoons 60 feet down in water warm enough that the wetsuit was almost unnecessary, practicing neutral buoyancy in a world that did not contain HOA board minutes or property line disputes. On Thursday evening, I checked the camera feed to find that Linda had visited the garage twice more, once in the morning, once in the early afternoon. The second time, 2 other people had come with her, a man and a woman, both of whom spent a long time looking at the weld seams and at the notices I had posted. The woman appeared to take a photo of the private property sign. They all left without touching anything. The center console screen in the lower camera frame was now visibly darker than it had been on day 1. I had also, on Tuesday, forwarded the entire documentation package to Tom Hendricks, the original photographs, the email thread to the board, Linda's voice-to-mail. She had called 6 times on day 1, leaving a message that would cut off mid-sentence by the system's time limit, and the first 3 days of camera footage. Tom responded within an hour. His assessment was clean. Nothing I had done was legally actionable from any direction. My securing of the property was lawful maintenance on private land. If Linda or anyone else attempted to forcibly breach the door, the statutory threshold for criminal mischief in this state started at a misdemeanor and scaled upward based on property value. Tom noted that the attempted forced entry would need to be documented clearly and that my existing camera setup was more than adequate for that purpose. He added one dry observation at the end of his note. I'd also suggest looking into a formal HOA grievance regarding Section 4.7 at some point. You'd probably win. I replied, let's let it develop a little further. Then I put the phone away and went to find something for dinner. She had not, I think, believed on that first morning that the situation would extend past a single afternoon. That was the read I got from the footage. A woman who had dealt with minor resistances before and expected this one to resolve by sundown the way they always had. The confidence in the way she first approached the garage on day 2 said, I am coming to collect something that is owed to me. She walked up the driveway at 9:23 in the morning, reached out, gripped the bottom rail of the door with both hands, and pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet, and pulled harder. Still nothing. She stood back and looked at the seam between the door panel and the frame, and I watched the exact moment of realization cross her face in the camera's wide-angle frame, a slow progression from certainty to confusion to something hot and involuntary moving up into her cheekbones. The door was not locked. It was not stuck. It had been permanently joined to the surrounding structure by someone who knew precisely what they were doing, and no amount of force applied by a human being without mechanical equipment was going to change that fact. She called me 4 times before 10 in the morning. I was on the water, cellular signal intermittent at best, and I let the calls go to voicemail with a clear conscience. The message she left before the system cut her off was, Mr. Foster, I am requiring you to open this garage door immediately. This is a serious violation of HOA governing documents, and I have the authority to... Then silence. I listened to it that evening, sitting on the bungalow porch with a glass of cold water, once, the way you listen to something that has already been decided. By mid-morning, she had brought in reinforcements. Greg Patel and Susan Cho from the HOA board, both of whom arrived in the posture of people who had been told this would be a quick formality. Greg stood in front of the weld seams for a while, then looked at the surveillance notice, then looked at the camera mounted above the door with its recording indicator glowing steadily red. He said something quietly to Linda that I could not read from the camera angle. Susan appeared to take a photograph of the notices. Then Greg said something else, and Linda made a gesture that suggested the conversation was over. Both board members left. Linda stayed alone at the driveway for a few minutes, then left as well. By early afternoon, she had produced an official HOA violation notice, which she slid under my front door despite knowing I was not home, a detail that would matter later. The notice cited two alleged violations: deliberate obstruction of community activities and failure to cooperate with HOA management directives. It was signed, dated, and formatted with the specific kind of institutional authority that works well on people who don't know their rights. I was not those people. Later that same day, I was informed by a neighbor, a retired school teacher named Eleanor Walsh, who lived 2 houses down and had apparently been watching the week's events with considerable interest, that Linda had posted on the neighborhood's community social platform. The caption above a photo of my sealed garage door described the resident at my address as engaging in hostile behavior toward the community and announced that corrective measures would be taken. Eleanor, bless her, had screenshotted the post, the comments below it, and the timestamp before forwarding them to me. The comments were not what Linda had intended. 6 separate neighbors had responded asking why the HOA chairwoman's personal vehicle was parked in another resident's private garage in the first place. 2 others asked what authority permitted the use of enclosed private structures under Section 4.7. One person, I did not know who, had posted a direct link to the relevant passage of state property law. I was eating dinner on the bungalow porch when the notifications came in. I read through Eleanor's screenshots carefully, then forwarded everything to Tom with a single line attached. She just publicly documented her own overreach. Tom responded within minutes. "This is genuinely useful. A public post from the HOA chairwoman implicitly acknowledging the dispute while misrepresenting the facts to the neighborhood is exactly the kind of secondary evidence that strengthens a grievance filing." I set the phone face down on the table and watched the last of the sunset drain out of the sky over the Gulf. The camera feed update I checked before sleeping was brief. 1 frame, 11:47 at night, the garage door unchanged, the driveway empty. And in the lower corner of the frame, the Mercedes' center console, dark, not dimmed, off. The battery had begun its final decline. Let's take a beat here. Linda just posted publicly, on the neighborhood's own platform, essentially confirming that she parked her car in someone's private garage without permission and is now demanding they open it, while John is on the back porch of a Florida bungalow watching the sunset. And did you catch that last detail in the feed? 11:47 at night, center console, dark. Not in standby. Off. A Mercedes E-Class W213 platform draws steady current from the 12-volt battery in accessory mode. No alternator, no charge, enclosed space, 14 days. The clock Linda started on a Saturday morning is ticking towards something she hasn't thought about yet. Drop a comment. What do you think she tries next? The call to emergency services came on day 3. I know this because the camera timestamp showed Officer Ramirez's patrol unit pulling up to my driveway at 10:14 in the morning, and Eleanor Walsh had texted me a heads up 11 minutes before that. Linda had apparently reported her vehicle as being unlawfully detained, a phrase that carries a specific legal meaning when applied to human beings and a considerably murkier one when applied to a car that its owner voluntarily drove into someone else's private garage without permission. I was in the middle of my second scuba session when the notifications came through. I read them during the surface interval, sitting on the dive platform with my fins still on, salt water drying on my forearms. Officer Ramirez and his partner, Officer Chen, were professional and thorough. They listened to Linda's account, walked the perimeter of my property, examined the garage door, read both posted notices in full, and looked at the camera mounted above the door for a moment that I imagine felt uncomfortable for Linda. Then Ramirez delivered the assessment in the measured, even tone of someone who has explained property law in a driveway before and expects to do it again. He told her that the garage was on private land, that the notices had been posted in compliance with state statute, that the owner had clearly communicated his position in advance, and that welding one's own door shut constituted lawful maintenance on one's own structure. He told her there was no legal basis for compelling a property owner to open a secured outbuilding on private land. Then Officer Chen added the piece that I suspect landed hardest. If she continued approaching the structure and attempted to breach it by force, she would be exposing herself to a criminal mischief charge, because the moment she applied destructive force to my property, regardless of what was inside it, she crossed from civil dispute into criminal territory. Linda stood in my driveway and listened to two uniformed officers explain to her, clearly and without apparent sympathy, that the institution she had believed would enforce her authority had just declined to do so. The camera caught her profile for a few frames as the officers walked back to their unit. She was looking at the garage door with the expression of someone recalculating a problem they had believed was already solved. The HOA board emergency session happened that same afternoon. I know the substance of it because Tom Hendricks received a courtesy call from Marcus Webb, the HOA's own retained attorney, 2 days later, as a professional heads-up between colleagues. Marcus had reviewed the email I sent to the board on day one and had walked the full board through his analysis before Linda could set the frame herself. The conclusion was unambiguous. Section 4.7 did not authorize the use of enclosed private structures. The HOA had no legal standing to demand I open my garage. More pressingly, the association itself was potentially exposed to a civil claim if Linda's actions, taken under the apparent banner of HOA authority, resulted in damage to my property or continued harassment of me as a resident. Greg Patel and Susan Cho, both of whom had stood in my driveway 2 days earlier watching a welded door refuse to move, apparently said very little during the meeting. The session ended without any resolution supporting Linda's position. Marcus, according to Tom, described the gathering as notably quiet for an emergency board meeting. Linda hired a locksmith on day 4. This I learned from the camera footage and from a brief, amused voicemail Tom left me on Thursday evening. The locksmith, a man in a gray work shirt who arrived in a van with a magnetic company logo on the door, spent approximately 4 minutes examining the garage door before delivering his verdict. He walked the seam line, pressed his palm flat against the surface, and then stepped back with the posture of someone who has just been asked to unlock a bridge. He told Linda, as I gathered from the footage of the two of them in conversation, that what she was looking at was not a mechanical lock, and therefore was not something his profession addressed. What she was looking at was structural metalwork. Cutting through it on someone else's private property without a court order was not a service his company provided, and was not a service he personally intended to provide under any financial arrangement she might suggest. He charged her $95 for the consultation and drove away. I watched that clip twice. It is, technically speaking, one of my favorite pieces of footage from the entire 2 weeks. Tom's update arrived by email that same evening, summarizing everything in 3 concise paragraphs. He ended with, "Every avenue Linda has tried, social pressure, institutional authority, law enforcement, professional services, has returned empty-handed. She has one option left, and it is the wrong one. Make sure the camera battery is fully charged." I was eating stone crab at a place on the water that had no indoor seating and a menu written on a chalkboard. I read Tom's note, ordered another round, and watched a brown pelican work the pilings for scraps. The camera was on continuous cloud backup. The battery was solar supplemented. Everything was fine. Day 5 arrived with the kind of Gulf Coast morning that makes you understand why people retire to Florida. Low light, flat water, the air still carrying the coolness of the night before. I was on the back porch with coffee when the first notification came through at 7:51. Motion detected at the garage. I let it queue. 2 more alerts followed before 8:15. I finished my coffee, went inside, and pulled up the feed on my laptop with the calm of someone reviewing security footage rather than the urgency of someone whose property is under threat. because by that point I understood that whatever was happening in front of my garage was happening on my terms, not Linda's. The pressure she was operating under had been building in visible layers. A dealership service alert had apparently gone out to the registered owner of the Mercedes, warning that extended inactivity could compromise the vehicle's battery management system. A fact I learned later from David Prescott, who was not a subtle man when he was stressed. The community platform was now a running commentary on the situation. With 47 posts in the thread Eleanor had been monitoring, the majority of them asking questions that Linda had no good answers to. And David himself had apparently shifted from passive to actively unhappy because when the two of them appeared on my driveway at 8:22 that morning, he was carrying a crowbar and wearing the expression of a man who has been told one too many times that the problem will work itself out. David wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door panel and the frame, the same gap that the locksmith had examined and declined to engage with, and applied leverage. The door did not open. The engineering I had put into those 8 weld points was not theatrical. It was calculated to withstand exactly this kind of opportunistic force. What the crowbar accomplished was a slight inward deformation of the lower door panel, which produced a sharp metallic groan and accomplished nothing else structurally. The camera recorded it all in clear, time-stamped detail. Across the property line, on the veranda of the neighboring house, Eleanor Walsh had come outside with her morning tea and, apparently, her phone. I noted her presence in the upper corner of the frame, a small, still figure in a cardigan, watching. I appreciated Eleanor Walsh more than I had ever adequately expressed. Officer Ramirez reappeared at 8:41, which I had not anticipated, but which in retrospect made perfect sense. He had been on the same patrol route as the previous visit, heard the metallic impact from the street, and pulled over. He stepped out of the unit and asked David to stop what he was doing in a tone that did not require a second request. David stepped back. Linda began explaining. Ramirez listened for approximately 30 seconds, then told them both, with the patience of a man who has had this exact conversation once already this week, that they were in the process of committing criminal mischief on private property, and that if they continued, the next step was not a warning. David put the crowbar down. Linda turned back toward the door. What happened next was entirely Linda's doing, and I want to be precise about that because it matters. While Ramirez was speaking to David, Linda stepped forward alone, gripped the lower edge of the door panel at the point where David's crowbar had bent the metal inward, and pulled with her full body weight. Both hands wrapped around the deformed edge, fingers curled into the gap. The bent metal had created a lip with an exposed cut edge, the kind that exists on deformed sheet steel when it has been stressed beyond its design tolerance. She pulled hard. The edge found her palm. She released the door immediately, stepped back, and the sound she made was sharp and involuntary. Not the theatrical outrage of the previous days, but the genuine, unfiltered reaction of a person who has just been hurt. It was a shallow laceration, not serious, bleeding more than it was deep. But it was real, and it was hers, and it had come entirely from her own decision to grab a piece of damaged metal with her bare hands, while a police officer was standing 10 feet away telling her to stop. Ramirez issued David a formal written warning on the spot, documented, signed, a matter of record. He called in the incident from his unit and flagged my property file for the clip-sharing protocol that Tom had established at the start of the trip, which meant the precinct now had access to the full camera archive if it was needed. Eleanor Walsh posted her video, shot from her veranda, clear and steady, capturing the crowbar, the impact, the door, and Linda's injury in a single uninterrupted sequence, to the neighborhood platform within the hour. The caption read, "Can someone explain why our HOA chairwoman is hitting the neighbor's garage with a crowbar?" 200 views in the first 90 minutes. I received a screenshot of it from Tom at 11:43, with 3 words in the subject line: "Save everything." Perfect. I was toweling off after a beach swim when I read it. I looked at the footage once, forwarded it with a timestamp log to Tom's office, and went to find lunch. A crowbar, then a hammer, then a cut hand, self-inflicted, on camera, with a police officer present. Nobody hurt Linda Prescott. John was eating stone crab on a Gulf Coast patio while this happened. She walked into the edge of her own bad decision, literally. And now, there is a video, a formal police warning on record. Eleanor Walsh and her steady phone hand. Over 200 neighbors who have watched the HOA chairwoman attempt to demolish a private garage door with hand tools. When John Foster lands back in this city, he is not returning to a conflict. He is returning to a completed case file. Chapter 7. And I'll warn you, is colder than you're expecting. The cab from the airport turned onto my street just after 8 in the morning on day 14. I had the window down. The neighborhood smelled the way it always does in late June. Cut grass, someone's sprinklers, the faint exhaust of early commuters clearing out. I had a carry-on bag and a fishing hat with a salt stain on the brim, and I had slept 4 hours on the red eye and felt fine. Some people come back from vacation wrung out. I came back from this one, rested in a way that had less to do with the beach and more to do with 2 weeks of watching a situation resolve itself without requiring anything further from me. She was standing at the end of my driveway. No navy blazer, no tablet, a thin cardigan over a blouse, one hand wrapped in a bandage that had been applied at some point in the past week and was now slightly frayed at the edges. She was standing the way people stand when they have been waiting a long time and are no longer certain what they are waiting for. Eleanor Walsh was across the street, pretending to deadhead her roses with the studied casualness of someone who has been watching a doorway and is not going to miss whatever comes through it. 2 other neighbors, a man I knew by sight and a woman I did not, were visible in their driveways, doing nothing with particular conviction. The street had the specific quality of a room where everyone is pretending not to listen. I paid the driver, took my bag, and walked up the path. Linda moved toward me immediately, the way a person moves when they have been rehearsing an opening line. "Mr. Foster," she said, "you have been gone for 2 weeks while my car has been locked inside your—" I said, "Good morning, Mrs. Prescott," and walked past her into the house. I set my bag down, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, drank a glass of water, and stood at the window for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then I went back to the door. She was on the porch. I did not invite her in. I stood in the frame and looked at her the way you look at someone when you are prepared to have a short, clear conversation. She told me she needed me to open the garage immediately, that the car had been inside for 14 days. I told her I was aware of that. I asked her if she remembered what I had said to her on that first Saturday morning, that this was private property, that I needed her permission request made in advance, that she did not have authorization to park there. She did not answer. I asked her if she remembered what she had said in response to that. She looked at the porch floor for a moment. I told her to give me 15 minutes. I changed into my work clothes, pulled the angle grinder from the cabinet, checked the disc, and went out to the garage. I did not look at Linda as I passed her. I set up at the first weld point, lower left, braced my stance, brought the disc to the bead, and started the grind. The sound of it carried clearly in the morning air, which I suspected was not unpleasant for the neighbors who had front row access. I worked through each of the 8 points in sequence, the same methodical order I had used going the other direction 2 weeks earlier. No performance in it, just a man finishing a job he had started. When the last bead was cleared, I set the grinder down, gripped the door handle with both hands, and raised it smoothly. The door rolled up on its track without resistance, exactly as it had been designed to do. Inside, the silver Mercedes sat precisely where Linda had left it. No scratches, no damage from my side, not a mark on the paint or glass that had not been there on the morning she drove it in. I stepped to the side and gestured toward it. A simple, open-handed indication that the vehicle was available, nothing more. Linda walked past me into the garage, settled into the driver's seat, straightened herself, and pressed the start button. The silence that followed was the kind that takes up physical space. She pressed it again. A faint, thin chime from the instrument cluster, barely audible, the last flickering of a system, trying to report in on almost no power, and the center console screen brightened for approximately 2 seconds and then went dark entirely. She pressed the button a third time. Nothing, not even the chime, just the complete definitive silence of a 12-volt battery that had been running an unattended electrical system for 336 hours with no source of charge and had finally, quietly, given out. Linda sat in the driver's seat and did not move for a moment. Through the windshield, I could see her hands on the wheel. Then she turned to look at me, standing in the garage doorway with my arms at my sides, and she said, very quietly, "The battery is dead." I said, "Yes." She said it again, slightly louder, as though the repetition might produce a different outcome. "The battery is dead." And I heard in it the first note of something genuinely unmoored, not the performed outrage of the previous 2 weeks, but the flat, undecorated recognition that a sequence of events had concluded in a way she had not modeled. I told her, in the same tone I would use to explain a mechanical failure to a client, that I had noticed on the first morning that she had left the vehicle's comfort cooling system active and the infotainment display running in accessory mode. I told her that the W213 platform's center stack draws approximately 2 to 3 amperes from the 12-volt auxiliary battery in standby, that the keyless entry module maintains a separate low-draw communication loop, and that without an alternator cycle to restore charge, in an enclosed space over 14 consecutive days, the result she was experiencing was not a surprise. It was arithmetic. She asked me very quietly if I had known this from the beginning. I told her I had not done anything to her battery. I told her she had activated those systems herself on the morning she parked the car, and that I had secured my property the way I was legally entitled to do, and that the two facts had intersected in the way that they had. She had no response to that. David arrived within the hour. He called roadside assistance, which sent a technician who spent 8 minutes with the car before explaining that a deep discharged absorbed glass mat battery, the type fitted to the E-Class, could not be safely jump-started by conventional means. The battery management system required a controlled slow charge cycle to recover, and even then, a cell that had reached full depletion had a measurably shortened service life going forward. The safest course was dealer service, which meant a flatbed. The flatbed cost $150. The dealership's diagnostic inspection was $200. A new absorbed glass mat battery of the correct specification was $450, plus installation. The battery management system recalibration was billed separately. Total, somewhere between $800 and $1,200, every cent of it a direct consequence of a decision Linda had made on a Saturday morning when she pressed the comfort cooling button and walked away from her car without a second thought. I was not responsible for any of it. No court in the county would have found otherwise. Tom Hendricks arrived while the flatbed was still in the street. He had driven over from his office, which was not something he typically did for routine matters, and the fact that he had made the trip in person told me the filing was ready. He handed Linda a sealed envelope, introduced himself by name and firm, and told her she was being formally notified of a grievance complaint filed with the county's HOA Oversight Board on behalf of John Foster, resident. The complaint documented the unauthorized use of private property under a misapplied covenant clause, the public defamation post made to the neighborhood platform, the attempted forced entry by 2 individuals using a crowbar and hammer, documented on time-stamped camera footage and corroborated by a sworn witness statement from Eleanor Walsh, and the formal HOA violation notice issued to an absent homeowner whose property had been illegally occupied at the time of issuance. The complaint requested a full review of Section 4.7, a formal censure of the board chairwoman's conduct and damages assessment. I was not standing in the driveway when Tom made the handoff. I had already gone inside. There was nothing left for me to do out there. The neighborhood platform had 1,400 views on Eleanor's video by early afternoon. The comments had moved past curiosity into something that looked like community consensus. People who had quietly watched a chairwoman accumulate unchecked authority for 7 years and were now, with the footage right in front of them, saying so clearly for the first time. 3 weeks later, Linda Prescott submitted her resignation from the HOA board, citing personal reasons in a statement of 4 sentences. The board accepted it at a special session that lasted 11 minutes. 6 weeks after that, the County Oversight Board issued a guidance memorandum requiring all residential HOAs in the district to audit their governing documents for covenant clauses that purported to authorize use of enclosed private structures, citing the grievance filed at my address as the case reference. Section 4.7 was amended at the following HOA annual meeting to include explicit exclusion language for garages, outbuildings, and any structure with a fixed enclosing wall. It passed unanimously. On a quiet evening about a month after I returned, I went out to the garage and stood in it for a while. The tools were where I had left them. The MIG welder was covered. The C-clamps were racked. There were 8 small areas on the door frame where the grinding had left the steel slightly bright. Not damaged, just worked. I took a strip of fine grit paper and smoothed each one, then touched them up with a rattle can of matching gray primer and let them dry. No ceremony to it. I turned the light off, pulled the door down, and went inside. The garage was mine. The vacation had been excellent, and Linda Prescott had spent 7 years in this neighborhood under the assumption that institutional authority was the same thing as actual power, only to learn, in the most direct way available, that a property line is not a suggestion, and that the person who truly understands what they own and what they're entitled to defend will always outlast the person who is merely performing control. When the line gets crossed, you don't have to shout to win. Lesson 1, know your rights before you act, not after. The first thing John Foster did when Linda Prescott drove her car into his garage was not confront her, not call the police, and not post about it anywhere. He called an attorney. He confirmed his legal footing before committing to a single action. That sequence matters more than people realize. The most common mistake in boundary disputes is responding emotionally and then trying to construct a justification afterward. John did the opposite. He built the justification first, then acted. HOA bylaws are not municipal law. They are private contracts, and they have limits. Know what the document actually says, and know what it cannot legally say. Lesson 2. Evidence is the only currency that doesn't lose value. Linda made a public post. Linda left voicemails. Linda brought a crowbar to a sealed garage door while a neighbor filmed from a veranda. Every one of those actions was a gift, because an uncontrolled person in a conflict will almost always generate their own evidence against themselves, provided the other party has the discipline not to generate counter noise. John photographed everything from the first minute, used email for formal communications, and installed a camera backing up automatically to the cloud. He said almost nothing publicly. When Linda escalated, he didn't escalate back. He documented. If you're in a dispute with someone who has more institutional power, your job is not to out-shout them. Your job is to be the quieter, more accurate record of what actually happened. Lesson 3. Natural consequences are the most persuasive punishment. The dead battery, the flatbed truck, the $800, John didn't cause any of it. He simply secured his property, which he was entitled to do. The consequence was Linda's because the decision was hers. When you enforce your rights through legitimate means, legal documentation, physical barriers you're entitled to construct, institutional channels you're entitled to use, you create conditions where the other person's choices determine their outcomes. You don't need to engineer their downfall. Build the wall correctly, document everything, then step back. The rest takes care of itself. Know your rights, record what happens, and if the moment calls for it, weld the door, pack your bags, and let the arithmetic do the rest.